mountains of Afghanistan, silence meant death. Poor Navy SEAL Team 6 operative Jake Morrison. The only sound he could hear was his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as he lay motionless behind enemy lines. His team was scattered, presumed dead, and 43 Taliban fighters surrounded his position. The mission that was supposed to be a routine extraction had become a nightmare that would test every skill he'd learned in his 12-year military career. What happened next would become legend among Special Operations Forces, a story whispered in training camps and briefing rooms around the world. It was a story of how one man's refusal to surrender turned certain defeat into one of the most remarkable victories in modern warfare history. But this isn't just a story about bullets and explosions. It's about brotherhood, sacrifice, and the moment when a single decision changes everything. The Taliban thought they had won. The Pentagon thought SEAL Team 6 was finished. Even Jake Morrison himself believed his time had come to an end. Nobody expected what was about to unfold in those treacherous mountains. Nobody except perhaps the warrior spirit that lives inside every true soldier. The one that whispers, never give up, even when hope seems lost forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains as SEAL Team 6 prepared for what intelligence briefings had described as a straightforward hostage extraction. Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical gear one final time, running through the mission parameters in his mind. 3 American aid workers had been captured by Taliban forces 5 days earlier, and satellite reconnaissance had pinpointed their location to a compound nestled in a valley approximately 20 miles northeast of Kandahar. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun gathered the 6-man team around a detailed topographical map spread across the hood of their armored vehicle. The plan seemed simple enough on paper. Fast rope insertion under cover of darkness, neutralize hostile forces, extract the hostages, and rendezvous with extraction helicopters at a predetermined landing zone. Chun had led dozens of similar operations throughout her 8-year career with the teams, and her steady confidence helped calm the pre-mission jitters that even seasoned operators experienced before heading into harm's way. Morrison studied the faces of his teammates as Chun outlined their individual responsibilities. To his left stood Marcus Tank Rodriguez, the team's heavy weapons specialist whose massive frame and gentle demeanor had earned him respect throughout the special operations community. Tank had saved Morrison's life twice in previous deployments, once in Iraq and once in Syria, creating a bond between the two men that transcended normal military partnerships. Next to Tank was Emily Ghost Patterson, the team's communications expert and one of the first women to complete SEAL training successfully. Her ability to remain calm under pressure and maintain contact with command during the most chaotic situations had become legendary among their peers. Rounding out the team were brothers Tommy and Mike Sullivan, identical twins whose uncanny ability to anticipate each other's movements in combat had made them invaluable assets during close-quarters operations. Tommy specialized in explosive ordnance disposal, while Mike served as the team's medic, their complementary skills making them an unstoppable duo when situations required both precision and medical expertise. The 6th team member, Staff Sergeant David Prophet Washington, was their sniper and reconnaissance specialist, a soft-spoken man from Georgia whose incredible marksmanship skills had earned him recognition throughout the military's elite circles. As the team conducted final equipment checks and loaded into their insertion helicopter, Morrison reflected on the intelligence briefing they had received just hours earlier. The captured aid workers were reportedly being held in a small compound consisting of 3 mud brick buildings surrounded by a low stone wall. Thermal imaging had identified approximately 15 heat signatures within the compound, suggesting a lightly defended position that should pose minimal threat to a well-trained SEAL team. However, Morrison's 12 years of combat experience had taught him that intelligence estimates were often incomplete and sometimes dangerously misleading. The helicopter lifted off just after sunset, its rotors cutting through the thin mountain air as they climbed toward their insertion point. Morrison gazed out at the rugged landscape below, noting how the deepening shadows created countless hiding spots where enemy forces could potentially establish ambush positions. The flight would take approximately 45 minutes, giving the team time to review their mission timeline and coordinate their movements once they reached the target area. Chen's voice crackled through their communication headsets as she provided final mission updates. Recent drone surveillance had confirmed the presence of the 3 hostages in the main building, and there were no indications of increased security measures or reinforcements in the area. The extraction helicopters would be standing by at a landing zone located 3 miles south of the compound, ready to evacuate the team and rescued hostages once the operation was complete. Morrison checked his primary weapon, a customized M4A1 carbine equipped with advanced optics and a suppressor, ensuring that all systems were functioning properly. His secondary weapon, a Sig Sauer P226 pistol, was secured in a tactical holster on his right thigh, and various other equipment, including grenades, medical supplies, and communication devices were distributed across his tactical vest and gear pouches. Every piece of equipment had been selected and positioned based on years of combat experience and countless training exercises. As the helicopter approached the insertion point, the pilot's voice announced their final descent toward the landing zone. The team would fast rope into a small clearing approximately 1 mile from the target compound, allowing them to approach on foot while maintaining the element of surprise. The helicopter's engines would be audible to anyone within several miles, but the insertion point was far enough away that enemy forces would likely assume the aircraft was conducting routine transportation operations rather than deploying special operations forces. Morrison was the 3rd team member to slide down the thick rope, his gloved hands controlling his descent as he dropped through 30 feet of darkness toward the rocky ground below. The landing was smooth and silent, years of training allowing him to absorb the impact without making any sound that might alert nearby enemies to their presence. Within 30 seconds, all 6 team members were on the ground, and the helicopter was disappearing into the night sky, leaving them alone in hostile territory. Chen immediately established their formation and began leading them toward the target compound along a predetermined route that would take advantage of natural terrain features to minimize their exposure to potential enemy observation posts. The team moved in single file, maintaining approximately 10-meter intervals between each operator while using night vision goggles to navigate through the darkness. Morrison found himself in the 3rd position, directly behind Tank and in front of Ghost, a positioning that allowed him to provide supporting fire if they encountered enemy resistance. The approach to the compound required nearly 2 hours of careful movement through increasingly difficult terrain. They encountered several potential ambush sites along the way, requiring Prophet to conduct detailed reconnaissance using his sniper scope to ensure no enemy forces were lying in wait. Each time they paused for these security checks, Morrison felt his adrenaline levels increase slightly, knowing that discovery at this stage would compromise the entire mission and potentially result in the execution of the hostages they were attempting to rescue. When they finally reached their overwatch position on a small ridge overlooking the target compound, Prophet deployed his sniper rifle and began conducting detailed surveillance of the buildings below. Through his scope, he could identify several armed guards patrolling the perimeter, confirming that the hostages were indeed being held at this location. The compound appeared exactly as described in their intelligence briefing, with 3 main structures and a low stone wall surrounding the entire facility. Chen established communication with their command center, providing an updated situation report and confirming their readiness to begin the assault phase of the operation. The hostages had been located in the eastern building, and thermal imaging indicated that most of the guards were concentrated around the main entrance and western building. This distribution of enemy forces would allow the team to approach the hostage location from an unexpected direction, increasing their chances of achieving complete surprise. Morrison positioned himself to provide covering fire for Tank and the Sullivan brothers as they prepared to breach the compound wall using small explosive charges. Ghost established her communication equipment to maintain contact with extraction helicopters and command personnel, while Prophet remained in his Overwatch position to engage any enemy forces that attempted to reinforce the compound during the assault. The team had rehearsed similar operations countless times during training, but Morrison knew that real combat always presented unexpected challenges that required immediate adaptation. The initial breach proceeded exactly as planned, with Tank's explosive charges creating a gap in the stone wall large enough for the team to enter quickly and quietly. Morrison followed the assault element through the opening, his weapon ready as they moved toward the building where the hostages were being held. The darkness worked in their favor, allowing them to approach within 50 meters of the structure before the first enemy guard detected their presence. Prophet's sniper rifle eliminated the guard with a single suppressed shot before he could raise an alarm, and the team continued their advance toward the hostage building. Morrison could see light emanating from several windows, indicating that people were awake inside the structure. As they reached the building's exterior wall, Chen signaled for the Sullivan brothers to prepare their breaching charges while the rest of the team established security positions around the immediate area. The explosion that created their entry point into the building was followed immediately by the team's rapid movement into the structure's interior. Morrison found himself clearing rooms alongside Tank, using well-practiced techniques to neutralize any threats while searching for the captured aid workers. They encountered 2 guards in the first room, both of whom were eliminated quickly before they could respond to the team's sudden appearance. Morrison heard Ghost's voice through his headset announcing that she had located the 3 hostages in a room at the rear of the building. All 3 appeared to be alive and conscious, though they showed obvious signs of mistreatment during their captivity. Tank secured the area while Morrison began cutting the ropes that bound the aid workers, speaking quietly to reassure them that they were American military personnel conducting a rescue operation. As the team prepared to evacuate the building with the rescued hostages, Prophet's urgent voice crackled through their communication system with devastating news. His elevated position had allowed him to observe a large convoy of vehicles approaching the compound from multiple directions, carrying what appeared to be significant reinforcements for the Taliban forces. Intelligence estimates had been catastrophically wrong about enemy strength in the area, and SEAL Team 6 was about to find themselves facing overwhelming odds in an extremely vulnerable position. Chun immediately ordered the team to accelerate their evacuation timeline and requested emergency extraction helicopter support, but Morrison could already hear the sound of approaching vehicles and knew they would not have enough time to reach their planned extraction point before enemy reinforcements arrived. The simple hostage rescue mission had suddenly become a desperate fight for survival against superior numbers in unfavorable terrain. Morrison checked his ammunition supply and prepared for what he suspected would become the most challenging engagement of his military career. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions as Taliban reinforcements began surrounding the compound. Prophet continued providing sniper support from his Overwatch position, but Morrison could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons indicating that they were being attacked from at least 4 different directions simultaneously. Tank positioned himself near the building's main entrance, his heavy machine gun ready to engage any enemy forces that attempted to assault their position directly. Ghost worked frantically to coordinate with extraction helicopters and request immediate air support, but Morrison knew that help was still at least 20 minutes away. The team would have to hold their current position against overwhelming odds while protecting 3 civilian hostages who had no combat training or protective equipment. Chun began organizing their defensive positions while the Sullivan brothers prepared additional explosive devices to discourage enemy assault attempts. Morrison found himself thinking about the families of his teammates and the promises he had made to return home safely from this deployment. The situation was rapidly deteriorating, and he could see the concern in Chen's eyes as she realized the magnitude of their predicament. However, SEAL training had prepared them for exactly these types of scenarios, and Morrison felt his mind automatically shifting into combat mode as muscle memory and years of experience began taking control of his actions. The first major enemy assault came from the western side of the compound, with approximately 15 Taliban fighters attempting to overrun Tank's position through concentrated fire and rapid movement. Morrison and the Sullivan brothers provided supporting fire while Tank's machine gun cut down several attackers before the remaining enemy forces retreated to covered positions. However, Morrison knew this was only the beginning of what would likely be a prolonged engagement against increasingly desperate enemy forces. As the night wore on, the team's ammunition supplies began running dangerously low while enemy pressure continued mounting from all directions. Prophet had been forced to abandon his overwatch position when enemy forces began climbing toward his location, and he was now trapped in a different part of the compound with limited ability to support the rest of the team. Morrison realized that their situation was becoming increasingly hopeless, and he began mentally preparing for the possibility that this mission might be their last. The Taliban fighters seemed to emerge from every shadow and crevice in the mountainous terrain, their numbers swelling beyond anything the intelligence reports had suggested. Morrison pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the compound, trying to make sense of how a simple extraction mission had deteriorated into what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated ambush. The enemy forces weren't simply reinforcements responding to their operation. They moved with the coordination and positioning of fighters who had been lying in wait for exactly this type of assault. Chen's tactical radio crackled with increasingly grim updates from their command center. The extraction helicopters had been forced to retreat due to heavy ground fire from multiple anti-aircraft positions that had materialized around the valley. Air support was being diverted from other operations, but it would take at least 30 minutes to arrive, and Morrison knew they didn't have that long. Tank's ammunition was running dangerously low, and the Sullivan brothers were down to their last few explosive charges. Morrison calculated their remaining resources while keeping careful watch through a narrow window opening. Each team member carried approximately 300 rounds of primary ammunition plus additional magazines for their secondary weapons, but they had already expended nearly half their supply during the initial defensive engagement. The three rescued hostages, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Engineer James Park, and translator Ahmad Hassan, huddled in the center of the room, their eyes wide with terror as bullets occasionally shattered pieces of the mud brick walls around them. The enemy forces had learned from their initial unsuccessful assault and were now adopting more sophisticated tactics. Instead of charging directly into Tank's machine gun fire, they were using covering fire to advance by small groups, slowly tightening their encirclement around the compound. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from positions that hadn't been occupied just minutes earlier, indicating that the Taliban fighters were systematically working their way closer to the building where the team had taken shelter. Ghost communication equipment suddenly sparked and went silent as an enemy sniper's bullet shattered a radio antenna, cutting off their last link to outside support. The team was now completely isolated in hostile territory, facing an unknown number of enemy combatants with dwindling ammunition and no immediate prospect of rescue. Morrison watched Chen's face as she absorbed the full implications of their situation, seeing the same grim determination that had carried her through previous impossible missions. Prophet's voice echoed across the compound as he called out target locations to the rest of the team. Despite being separated from the main group, he had found a defensive position in one of the compound's outbuildings and was using his sniper rifle to eliminate key enemy personnel. His precision shooting was helping to slow the Taliban advance, but Morrison knew that even Prophet's exceptional skills couldn't hold off an entire army indefinitely. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors briefly raised Morrison's hopes until he realized the aircraft wasn't flying in the typical pattern of American military helicopters. Through his night vision goggles, he could see an old Soviet-era Mi-17 transport helicopter settling into a landing zone approximately 500 meters from the compound. Additional enemy reinforcements began pouring out of the aircraft, including several fighters carrying rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. Morrison's mind raced through possible escape routes and tactical options, but every scenario seemed to end with the team being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The compound's stone walls provided excellent defensive positions, but they also created a trap if the enemy forces succeeded in surrounding them completely. Breaking out would require abandoning their defensive advantages and moving across open ground while carrying 3 civilians who had no combat training. Tank's machine gun suddenly fell silent as he exhausted his remaining ammunition, and Morrison heard him calling for additional magazines from anyone who could spare them. The Sullivan brothers immediately began redistributing their remaining ammunition, but Morrison knew they were simply delaying the inevitable. Without resupply or air support, the team would eventually be forced to make increasingly difficult choices about resource allocation and defensive priorities. Chun gathered the team for a quick tactical conference while Ghost and Prophet maintained security watches. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and they needed to decide whether to attempt a breakout toward the extraction zone or continue defending their current position until help arrived. Both options carried enormous risks, particularly with civilian hostages who would slow their movement and require constant protection during any attempt to reach safety. Morrison volunteered to conduct a solo reconnaissance mission to determine the exact positions and strength of the enemy forces surrounding them. His plan was to slip out through a small gap in the compound's rear wall and gather intelligence that might reveal a weakness in the Taliban encirclement. Chun initially resisted the idea, knowing that losing another team member would further reduce their defensive capabilities, but Morrison argued that they needed accurate information to make informed decisions about their survival strategy. The reconnaissance mission required Morrison to crawl through nearly 200 meters of rocky terrain while avoiding numerous enemy positions. His training in stealth and camouflage techniques proved invaluable as he moved silently between boulder formations and dry creek beds, pausing frequently to observe Taliban fighter positions through his night vision equipment. What he discovered was far worse than any of them had imagined. The enemy forces had established a complete encirclement of the compound, using more than 60 fighters positioned in carefully coordinated defensive positions. They had deployed heavy weapons including mortars and recoilless rifles that could easily destroy the buildings where the SEAL team was sheltering. Most concerning was the presence of what appeared to be foreign military advisors who were directing the Taliban fighters with professional tactical expertise that suggested extensive military training. Morrison's return journey to the compound required even more careful navigation as enemy forces had continued tightening their positions during his absence. He barely avoided detection twice when Taliban patrols passed within 10 meters of his concealed position, forcing him to remain motionless for several minutes while enemy fighters searched the immediate area. The intelligence he had gathered painted a picture of hopelessness that he wasn't sure he could share with his teammates without destroying their remaining morale. When Morrison finally reached the compound and rejoined his team, Chun immediately recognized the gravity of their situation from his facial expression. He provided a detailed briefing on enemy positions and capabilities, carefully presenting the facts without offering his own assessment of their survival chances. The team absorbed the information silently, each member running through their own tactical calculations and reaching similar conclusions about the impossibility of their circumstances. The first mortar rounds began falling on the compound just as Morrison finished his briefing, sending chunks of stone and debris flying through the air around them. The enemy forces had evidently decided to soften their defensive positions before launching a final assault, and the building they were sheltering in shook violently with each explosion. The 3 rescued hostages pressed themselves against the floor while the SEAL team members took positions near windows and doorways, preparing for the inevitable ground attack that would follow the bombardment. Tank discovered a cache of old Soviet-era ammunition in one of the compound's storage rooms, providing them with additional rounds for their weapons, but raising questions about who had previously occupied this facility. The ammunition was decades old and of questionable reliability, but it represented precious additional firepower that might extend their defensive capabilities for a few more minutes. Morrison helped distribute the ammunition while noting how quickly their situation had moved beyond normal tactical planning into pure survival instinct. Prophet's sniper rifle continued picking off enemy targets despite the mortar bombardment, his exceptional marksmanship skills allowing him to eliminate key personnel even under extremely difficult conditions. Morrison could hear his teammates' steady breathing and calm shot placement through their tactical communication system, drawing inspiration from Prophet's professional composure under impossible circumstances. However, even Prophet's skills couldn't change the mathematical reality of 6 operators facing overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The mortar bombardment intensified as the enemy forces prepared for their final assault, with explosions landing progressively closer to the building where the team had established their defensive positions. Morrison realized that the Taliban commanders were systematically destroying the compound structures to eliminate any remaining cover for the SEAL team. The building they currently occupied would soon become untenable, forcing them to make critical decisions about their final defensive stand. Chun made the difficult decision to prepare for a fighting withdrawal toward a more defensible position in the compound's eastern section, where natural rock formation might provide better protection against the mortar fire. The movement would require exposing themselves to enemy fire while carrying the 3 civilian hostages, but remaining in their current position guaranteed certain death when the building eventually collapsed under continued bombardment. Morrison volunteered to provide rear-guard security during the withdrawal, positioning himself to cover the team's movement while engaging any enemy forces that attempted to exploit their temporary vulnerability. His role would essentially involve sacrificing his own safety to ensure that his teammates and the rescued hostages had the maximum possible chance of reaching the alternate defensive position. Chun initially refused his request, but Morrison argued that his position as the team's most experienced close-quarters combat specialist made him the logical choice for this mission. The withdrawal began during a brief pause in the mortar bombardment, with Ghost leading the 3 civilians while the Sullivan brothers provided covering fire from flanking positions. Morrison remained in the original building, his weapon trained on the most likely enemy approach routes, as his teammates moved across the compound's interior courtyard. The movement required approximately 2 minutes to complete, during which time Morrison felt completely isolated and exposed to potential enemy assault. Taliban fighters began their ground attack, just as the team reached their new defensive positions, rushing toward the compound from multiple directions while providing covering fire for each other's advancement. Morrison found himself facing at least 8 enemy fighters who were attempting to overrun his position through sheer numbers and aggressive tactics. His training and experience allowed him to eliminate several attackers, but he quickly realized that his position was becoming untenable as additional enemy forces joined the assault. Morrison's radio crackled with Chin's urgent order to fall back to the new defensive position, but he could see that enemy fighters would reach his teammates before he could complete the withdrawal movement. The only way to ensure the team's survival was to maintain his current position and continue engaging the attacking forces, even though doing so meant accepting almost certain death. Morrison made his decision and continued firing at the advancing Taliban fighters while his teammates established their final defensive perimeter. The last thing Morrison heard before an explosion knocked him unconscious was Ghost's voice calling his name through the tactical communication system. When he regained consciousness several minutes later, the compound had fallen silent except for the sound of enemy voices searching through the debris. Morrison realized that he was trapped under a collapsed section of wall with injuries that prevented him from moving, while Taliban fighters systematically searched for survivors among the ruins of what had been their defensive positions. Morrison's world became a kaleidoscope of pain and confusion as consciousness slowly returned to his battered body. The weight of concrete and twisted metal pressed down on his legs, trapping him beneath the rubble of what had once been the compound's main building. Every breath sent sharp spikes of agony through his ribs, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. His left shoulder felt wrong, probably dislocated from the blast that had brought the building down around him. Through the gaps in the debris, Morrison could hear Taliban fighters moving through the compound, their voices growing closer as they conducted systematic searches for survivors. Their tone suggested they believed they had achieved complete victory, discussing the distribution of weapons and equipment they had recovered from the defeated American forces. Morrison forced himself to remain absolutely still despite the excruciating pain, knowing that any sound or movement would reveal his position and result in immediate execution. The silence from his tactical radio was perhaps the most devastating aspect of his situation. Throughout the final assault, he had heard his teammates' voices coordinating their defensive efforts and calling out target locations. Now, there was nothing but empty static, suggesting that either his communication equipment had been damaged in the explosion or his teammates were no longer in a position to transmit. Morrison tried not to think about the implications of that silence. His weapons were nowhere within reach, having been scattered or buried when the building collapsed around him. Morrison's primary rifle was visible, but trapped under a concrete beam approximately 3 meters away, while his secondary pistol remained in its holster but pinned beneath his own body by the debris. Even if he could free himself from the rubble, he would be essentially defenseless against multiple armed enemies. Morrison began conducting a careful mental inventory of his remaining resources and capabilities. His body armor had protected him from most of the blast fragments, but he could feel warm blood seeping from several wounds on his arms and face. His legs were trapped, but seemed to have avoided major injury, suggesting that the debris had created a protective pocket around his lower body. Most importantly, his mind remained clear and focused despite the physical trauma he had sustained. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Morrison to close his eyes and control his breathing, feigning unconsciousness as 2 Taliban fighters began searching through the rubble near his position. Their conversation revealed that they were looking for American bodies to confirm their victory, and Morrison realized they would eventually discover him if he remained in his current location. However, any attempt to move would certainly alert them to his survival. One of the fighters stepped directly onto the concrete slab that was pinning Morrison's legs, sending fresh waves of agony through his already damaged body. Morrison bit down on his tongue to prevent any involuntary sound from escaping, tasting more blood as he fought to maintain the illusion of death. The fighter paused for several seconds, apparently examining something he had found among the debris, before continuing his search in a different direction. Morrison waited until the voices moved to another section of the compound before attempting to assess his tactical situation more thoroughly. From his limited vantage point, he could see portions of the compound's courtyard where bodies lay scattered among the wreckage of the final battle. His heart stopped as he recognized pieces of familiar equipment and uniforms, but the distance and debris made it impossible to identify specific individuals or determine whether any of his teammates had survived. The systematic nature of the Taliban's search suggested they were operating under orders to recover all American equipment and confirm the elimination of all enemy personnel. Morrison knew that discovery was inevitable unless he could find a way to escape from the rubble trap that currently concealed him. However, any movement would require shifting heavy debris that would certainly create noise and attract immediate attention from the nearby enemy forces. Morrison's military training had included extensive instruction in survival and evasion techniques, but this situation exceeded anything he had encountered in classroom scenarios or previous combat deployments. The combination of serious injuries, limited mobility, and overwhelming enemy presence created a survival puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. However, Morrison's 12 years of special operations experience had taught him that impossible situations sometimes contained hidden opportunities for those willing to take extraordinary risks. The compound's layout began forming a mental map in Morrison's mind as he recalled the reconnaissance mission he had conducted earlier in the night. He remembered observing several drainage culverts and utility trenches that ran beneath the compound's main structures, possibly providing concealed movement routes if he could find a way to access them. The challenge would be escaping from his current position without alerting the Taliban fighters to his presence. Morrison began the painstakingly slow process of testing each piece of debris that surrounded him, searching for any sections that might be shifted quietly without causing a general collapse. His injured shoulder protested every movement, but he gradually discovered that one corner of the concrete slab could be lifted slightly if he positioned his good arm correctly. The process would require enormous physical effort and carry significant risk of detection, but it represented his only chance of escape. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance provided Morrison with the first ray of hope he had felt since regaining consciousness. However, the aircraft's engine noise suggested it was another Taliban transport rather than American rescue forces, and his heart sank as he realized the enemy was continuing to reinforce their positions rather than withdrawing after their victory. The helicopter settled into a landing zone near the compound, and Morrison could hear additional voices joining the search efforts. Morrison's escape attempt would have to wait until the new arrivals completed their initial activities and the compound returned to a lower level of activity. He used the waiting time to develop a more detailed plan for reaching one of the drainage systems he remembered from his earlier reconnaissance. The nearest culvert entrance was approximately 50 meters from his current position, requiring him to cross open ground while avoiding detection by an unknown number of enemy personnel. A disturbing conversation between two Taliban commanders revealed that they were expecting additional American rescue forces to arrive within the next few hours. The enemy forces were planning to use the compound as an ambush site, hoping to destroy any helicopters that attempted to extract survivors or recover bodies from the failed mission. Morrison realized that his escape wasn't just about his own survival. He might be the only person capable of warning incoming rescue forces about the trap that awaited them. The weight of that responsibility added urgency to Morrison's escape planning, but it also provided him with renewed determination to overcome his injuries and tactical disadvantages. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the compound, American pilots and aircrew were preparing to risk their lives in an attempt to bring him and his teammates home. Morrison couldn't allow those brave individuals to fly into an ambush without warning, even if attempting to help them cost him his own life. Morrison's first attempt to shift the concrete debris was interrupted when a Taliban fighter returned to search the area more thoroughly. The enemy soldier spent nearly 10 minutes examining every piece of rubble within a few meters of Morrison's hiding place, occasionally moving debris and checking underneath various objects. Morrison forced himself to remain completely motionless despite the incredible pain in his shoulder, knowing that this might be his last chance to remain undetected. The fighter eventually moved on to search other areas of the compound, but his thorough examination had revealed that Morrison's concealment was far from perfect. The next search would almost certainly discover his presence, meaning that his escape attempt could no longer be delayed regardless of the risks involved. Morrison began the careful process of lifting the concrete slab, using his good arm to create just enough space to begin extracting his trapped legs. Each movement required Morrison to pause and listen for approaching enemies while fighting through waves of pain and dizziness. His body was approaching the limits of its endurance after hours of combat, followed by serious injuries and blood loss. However, Morrison's mental training allowed him to compartmentalize the physical discomfort and focus entirely on the mechanical requirements of his escape effort. Morrison's legs were finally free from the debris, but testing their functionality revealed that his left ankle was either severely sprained or fractured. Walking would be possible, but slow and painful, creating additional challenges for any attempt to cross the compound undetected. Morrison realized he would have to modify his escape route to take advantage of cover and concealment opportunities while minimizing the distance he needed to travel on foot. The compound's layout now worked in Morrison's favor as he began moving slowly between piles of rubble and destroyed equipment. The Taliban fighters had completed their initial search and were now focused on establishing defensive positions for their planned ambush, giving Morrison opportunities to move during periods when enemy attention was focused elsewhere. His progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers, but Each successful movement brought him closer to the drainage system that represented his path to freedom. Morrison's most dangerous moment came when he was forced to cross an open area where moonlight would clearly reveal his silhouette to any observant enemy forces. He waited for a cloud to pass across the moon before beginning his movement, crawling on his belly while dragging his injured leg behind him. The crossing required nearly 3 minutes of exposure, during which time Morrison expected to hear shouts of alarm or the sound of weapons being prepared to fire. Reaching the drainage culvert entrance felt like the greatest victory of Morrison's military career, even though he knew the most challenging aspects of his escape were still ahead. The concrete tunnel was partially filled with debris and standing water, requiring him to crawl through extremely confined spaces while fighting claustrophobia and the constant pain from his injuries. However, the tunnel system would allow him to move beneath the compound without detection, potentially reaching the perimeter where he could begin his journey toward the extraction zone. Morrison's progress through the drainage system was measured in inches as he navigated around collapsed sections and flooded areas. The darkness was absolute, forcing him to feel his way forward while trying to maintain his sense of direction and distance traveled. His shoulder wound reopened during the crawling movement, adding fresh blood loss to his growing list of medical concerns that would eventually require immediate treatment. The sound of voices and footsteps directly overhead reminded Morrison that he was moving beneath Taliban positions, requiring absolute silence despite the difficult conditions inside the tunnel. Any metallic sound from his equipment or involuntary noise from pain would immediately reveal his location to enemy forces who would have no difficulty trapping him in the confined space. Morrison removed several pieces of his gear to eliminate potential noise sources, keeping only essential items that might be needed for his continued survival. Morrison's emergence from the drainage system occurred at the compound's northeastern corner, providing him with his first clear view of the tactical situation since his escape began. The sight that greeted him confirmed his worst fears about the fate of his teammates, while also revealing the scope of the ambush that had been prepared for incoming rescue forces. Taliban fighters had positioned heavy weapons throughout the compound and surrounding hills, creating a kill zone that would be virtually impossible for helicopters to survive. Morrison's heart shattered as he observed the compound from his concealed position in the drainage outlet. 6 body bags were lined up in the courtyard, their dark forms barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakably containing his fallen teammates. The Taliban fighters moved around them with casual indifference, occasionally stepping over the bags while carrying looted equipment and weapons to collection points. Morrison forced himself to look away, knowing that dwelling on grief would compromise his ability to complete the mission that now fell to him alone. The enemy force distribution was even worse than he had initially estimated. Through careful observation, Morrison counted at least 80 Taliban fighters positioned throughout the compound and surrounding ridges. They had established multiple heavy machine gun nests, mortar positions, and rocket-propelled grenade teams that would create overlapping fields of fire against any aircraft attempting to approach the area. The ambush was professionally planned and executed by someone with extensive military training and tactical expertise. Morrison's tactical situation was beyond hopeless by any conventional measure. He was a single wounded operator with limited ammunition and equipment, facing an enemy force that outnumbered him 80-1. His teammates were dead, his primary mission had failed, and he was trapped deep in hostile territory with no immediate prospect of rescue or support. However, Morrison's 12-year career had taught him that hopeless situations sometimes contain opportunities that weren't apparent to conventional military thinking. The Taliban commanders had made one critical error in their ambush planning. Their focus on creating an impregnable defensive position had led them to concentrate their forces in easily identifiable locations, making them predictable targets for someone with Morrison's training and experience. More importantly, their confidence in their overwhelming advantage had made them complacent about security procedures, creating potential vulnerabilities that a single determined operator might be able to exploit. Morrison began developing what he recognized as essentially a suicide mission. His chances of survival were virtually zero, but he might be able to disrupt the Taliban ambush enough to warn incoming rescue forces or create opportunities for them to survive the attack. The key would be identifying the enemy's critical vulnerabilities and striking at them in a coordinated sequence that would cause maximum confusion and disruption. The enemy's ammunition depot was located in the compound's western building, centrally positioned to support all of the Taliban defensive positions. Destroying this facility would cripple their ability to sustain prolonged combat while creating a significant explosion that might eliminate several adjacent positions. Morrison noted that the depot was guarded by only 2 fighters, suggesting that the enemy commanders considered it safe from attack due to their overwhelming control of the surrounding area. Morrison's observation of enemy movement patterns revealed that the Taliban forces conducted regular communications checks every 30 minutes, with squad leaders reporting their status to a central command post established in the compound's main building. This predictable schedule would provide him with precisely timed opportunities to move between positions while enemy attention was focused on radio communications rather than perimeter security. The compound's defensive positions have been established with overlapping fields of fire designed to engage aircraft approaching from any direction. However, this same configuration created blind spots and dead zones where ground movement would be concealed from observation. Morrison began mentally mapping these areas, identifying a route that would allow him to approach the ammunition depot without being detected by the multiple security positions. Morrison's equipment inventory revealed resources that were barely adequate for his planned assault. His remaining ammunition consisted of 2 magazines for his recovered pistol plus 4 grenades that had somehow survived the building collapse. His tactical knife and basic first aid supplies were intact, but his primary communications equipment remained buried in the rubble where he had been trapped. Most critically, he had no way to contact incoming rescue forces to warn them about the ambush. The first phase of Morrison's plan required him to reach the ammunition depot and prepare improvised explosive devices using his remaining grenades and any materials he could scavenge from the compound. The depot's destruction would need to occur simultaneously with attacks on the enemy's command post and primary communications equipment, creating maximum confusion during the critical moments when rescue helicopters might be approaching the area. Morrison's movement toward the ammunition depot required nearly 2 hours of painstakingly careful navigation through the compound's defensive positions. His injured ankle slowed his progress significantly, forcing him to rest frequently while maintaining absolute silence and concealment. Several times he was forced to remain motionless for extended periods when Taliban patrols passed within arm's reach of his position, their casual conversations revealing their complete confidence in their tactical superiority. The guards at the ammunition depot were younger fighters who appear to have less combat experience than the veterans positioned at other key locations. Morrison observed their routine for 30 minutes, noting that they maintained only casual vigilance while spending most of their time discussing the success of their ambush and their expectations for the arrival of American rescue forces. Their complacency would work in Morrison's favor during the critical moments of his assault. Morrison's approach to the depot was facilitated by a drainage ditch that ran directly beneath the building's eastern wall. The previous night's rain had filled the ditch with several inches of muddy water, muffling any sounds he might make while providing excellent concealment from the guards above. However, crawling through the cold water aggravated his injuries and increased his blood loss, adding urgency to his need to complete the mission quickly. The depot building's construction was typical of rural Afghan architecture, with thick mud brick walls and a flat roof supported by wooden beams. Morrison identified several structural weaknesses where his grenades could be positioned to achieve maximum destruction of the stored ammunition. However, gaining access to the building would require eliminating the guards without alerting other nearby positions, a challenge that would test every aspect of his close-quarters combat training. Morrison's attack on the guards occurred during the next scheduled communications check, when the surrounding positions were focused on their radio transmissions rather than observing the depot area. His approach was silent and swift, using techniques learned during years of special operations training to eliminate both guards before they could raise an alarm. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 seconds, leaving Morrison in control of the depot, with his presence still unknown to the broader enemy force. Inside the ammunition depot, Morrison discovered a much larger weapons cache than intelligence estimates had suggested. The building contained hundreds of rounds of mortar ammunition, rocket-propelled grenades, assault rifle magazines, and several cases of military-grade explosives. This discovery explained how the Taliban forces had been able to sustain such intensive combat operations, and it also provided Morrison with the materials needed to create an explosion that would devastate the entire compound. Morrison worked quickly to position his improvised explosive device among the stored ammunition, using his remaining grenades as primary charges to detonate the larger cache. The blast would be enormous, likely destroying most of the compound and eliminating significant numbers of enemy forces. However, Morrison knew he would be at the center of the explosion with no realistic chance of survival, making this final act of the mission a deliberate sacrifice to protect incoming rescue forces. Setting the timer on his improvised device required Morrison to calculate the precise moment when his explosion would provide maximum benefit to approaching rescue helicopters. Intelligence briefings had suggested that extraction forces would arrive approximately 6 hours after the original mission timeline, meaning Morrison had roughly 2 hours to prepare additional surprises for the Taliban ambush positions before triggering the main explosion. Morrison's movement through the compound after leaving the ammunition depot was aided by the confusion he began creating through small-scale sabotage operations. He systematically damaged communication equipment, disabled several heavy weapons, and eliminated isolated enemy personnel using techniques designed to make their disappearance appear accidental or attributable to equipment malfunctions. Each successful action reduced the enemy's combat capabilities while maintaining the element of surprise for his primary assault. The Taliban command post was located in the compound's main building, protected by multiple layers of security that would normally make it impossible for a single operator to penetrate. However, Morrison's intimate knowledge of the building's layout from their earlier assault provided him with advantages that the enemy commanders couldn't have anticipated. He knew exactly where to find concealed entry points and how to navigate the interior without triggering defensive measures. Morrison's infiltration of the command post occurred during the early morning hours when fatigue was beginning to affect enemy alertness levels. The Taliban commanders had been awake for nearly 24 hours coordinating their ambush preparations, and their reduced vigilance created opportunities that Morrison exploited with ruthless efficiency. His attack on the command post eliminated 3 senior leaders while destroying critical communications equipment and tactical planning materials. The enemy's reaction to the loss of their command post confirmed Morrison's assessment of their tactical capabilities. Rather than conducting systematic searches or implementing emergency procedures, the Taliban forces began responding emotionally to the mysterious attacks occurring throughout their positions. Their discipline began breaking down as individual units lost contact with Central Command and started making independent decisions based on incomplete information. Morrison's final act of preparation involved positioning himself in the compound's central courtyard where his ammunition depot explosion would have maximum impact on the surrounding defensive positions. He had approximately 30 minutes remaining before the timed charges would detonate, providing him with a final opportunity to eliminate additional enemy personnel and further disrupt their ambush preparations. The sight of his teammates' body bags in the courtyard filled Morrison with a combination of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm his tactical discipline. These were the men and women who had trusted him to watch their backs during countless dangerous missions, and he had failed to protect them when it mattered most. However, Morrison channeled those emotions into determination to ensure that their sacrifice would not be in vain. Morrison's position in the courtyard allowed him to observe the entire compound and identify the most critical enemy positions that remained functional despite his sabotage efforts. 3 heavy machine gun nests and 2 mortar positions still possessed the capability to engage rescue helicopters effectively, requiring him to eliminate or disable them before the arrival of extraction forces. Each target would require precise timing and exceptional accuracy with his limited remaining ammunition. The sound of approaching helicopters in the distance confirmed that rescue forces were beginning their approach toward the compound. Morrison estimated that the aircraft were still approximately 15 minutes away, providing him with sufficient time to complete his final attacks before triggering the ammunition depot explosion. However, he could also see Taliban forces preparing their heavy weapons and coordinating their defensive positions in response to the approaching aircraft. Morrison's assault on the remaining Taliban positions was a masterpiece of tactical planning and execution under impossible circumstances. He moved between targets with the fluid precision of a warrior operating at the absolute peak of his capabilities, eliminating enemy personnel and disabling equipment while staying ahead of their attempts to locate and engage him. Each successful attack brought him closer to his ultimate goal of protecting the incoming rescue forces. The final moments before the ammunition depot explosion were marked by Morrison's achievement of something approaching tactical perfection. He had eliminated or disabled nearly 40 enemy personnel, destroyed most of their heavy weapons, and created sufficient confusion to disrupt their planned ambush. The approaching rescue helicopters would still face significant dangers, but they would be entering a fight rather than flying into a carefully orchestrated death trap. Morrison's last conscious thought as he waited for the explosion was a prayer for his fallen teammates, and hope that the incoming rescue forces would successfully complete their mission. The ammunition depot detonation would mark the end of his story, but it might also represent the beginning of survival for others who deserved to return home to their families. Morrison closed his eyes and prepared for the final chapter of his war. The explosion that erupted from the ammunition depot exceeded even Morrison's calculations, creating a blast that lit up the entire valley like an artificial sunrise. The shockwave rippled outward in all directions, shattering windows and buildings several kilometers away and creating a mushroom cloud of debris that rose high into the morning sky. The sound was deafening, echoing off the surrounding mountains and valleys for several seconds after the initial detonation. Morrison found himself airborne for what seemed like an eternity before crashing into a pile of rubble nearly 50 meters from his original position. The blast had thrown him clear of the compound's central courtyard, and somehow he was still conscious despite suffering additional injuries that should have been fatal. His body armor had absorbed most of the blast fragments, but he could feel broken ribs grinding against each other with every breath he attempted to take. The compound where Morrison had spent the previous night fighting for his life had been transformed into an unrecognizable wasteland of twisted metal and smoking crater. The ammunition depot explosion had created a hole in the ground nearly 20 meters across, and the blast had leveled every structure within a 100-meter radius. Bodies of Taliban fighters lay scattered across the devastated landscape, their planned ambush positions now marked only by burning debris and shattered weapons. Morrison's hearing had been severely damaged by the explosion, reducing the world around him to a surreal mixture of muffled sounds and ringing noise that made it difficult to determine the direction or distance of various activities. However, he could see the silhouettes of helicopters approaching through the smoke and dust clouds that still hung over the compound, suggesting that rescue forces had arrived and were beginning their search for survivors. The rescue helicopters circled the compound cautiously, their crews undoubtedly shocked by the scale of destruction they were observing from above. Morrison could see door gunners scanning the ground through their weapons optics, searching for any remaining enemy forces that might threaten their mission. The pilot's voice crackled through Morrison's damaged radio, requesting identification from any American personnel in the area. Morrison attempted to respond to the radio call, but his voice was barely a whisper due to damage sustained during the explosion. He tried to activate an emergency beacon, but most of his equipment had been destroyed or lost during his flight through the air. However, he managed to find a signal flare in one of his remaining gear pouches, providing him with a means to identify his location to the rescue forces circling overhead. The red flare arced through the smoky air above the compound, immediately drawing the attention of the rescue helicopter crews, who adjusted their flight pattern to investigate the signal source. Morrison could see crew members preparing rappelling equipment and medical supplies as the lead aircraft moved toward his position. However, he could also see movement among the compound's ruins that suggested some enemy forces had survived the explosion and might still pose a threat to the rescue operation. Morrison's attempt to warn the incoming rescue team about potential remaining enemy forces was frustrated by his damaged voice and radio equipment. He tried using hand signals and emergency procedures, but the smoke and debris clouds made visual communication difficult even at close range. The rescue helicopter settled into a landing zone approximately 50 meters from Morrison's position, and he could see armed security personnel beginning to establish a defensive perimeter around the aircraft. The first rescue team member to reach Morrison was Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a combat medic whose calm professionalism immediately took control of his medical situation. She began assessing his injuries while simultaneously coordinating with other team members to establish security and prepare for medical evacuation. Her reassuring presence provided Morrison with the first sense of safety he had felt since the mission began more than 12 hours earlier. Morrison's medical condition was far worse than he had realized during his solo assault on the Taliban positions. Gonzalez identified multiple fractures, severe blood loss, and potential internal injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. However, her primary concern was preventing him from going into shock during the evacuation flight, requiring her to establish intravenous access and begin fluid replacement while preparing him for helicopter transport. The rescue operation became increasingly complicated as additional Taliban forces began arriving in response to the massive explosion that had destroyed their planned ambush. These reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions, forcing the rescue team to balance their medical responsibilities with the need to maintain security during what was becoming an extended ground operation. Morrison could hear gunfire beginning to erupt around the compound's perimeter as the two forces made contact. Morrison tried to provide intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities to the rescue team commander, but his damaged voice and mental confusion from his injuries made communication extremely difficult. However, Gonzalez understood enough of his information to relay warnings about remaining Taliban forces and the possibility that additional enemy reinforcements were approaching the compound from the surrounding valleys. The discovery of Morrison's teammates' bodies added another layer of complexity to the rescue operation, as military protocol required recovering all American personnel, regardless of the tactical risks involved. The rescue team had to divide their resources between protecting Morrison during his medical evacuation and conducting recovery operations for the fallen SEAL team members. This dual mission significantly extended their exposure to enemy fire and potential reinforcement activities. Morrison's evacuation helicopter lifted off under heavy enemy fire, with door gunners engaging Taliban positions that had survived the ammunition depot explosion. The aircraft's pilot executed a series of evasive maneuvers to avoid rocket-propelled grenades and small arms fire, while Morrison received continued medical treatment from Gonzalez during the turbulent flight. The journey to the nearest medical facility required nearly 45 minutes of flight time over hostile territory, where additional enemy forces might have established ambush positions. The medical team at Bagram Airfield was waiting for Morrison's arrival, having been alerted about his condition during the evacuation flight. He was immediately transferred to the base's trauma center, where surgeons began addressing his multiple injuries, while specialists evaluated his overall medical status. The surgery required nearly 8 hours to complete, addressing fractures, internal bleeding, and various complications resulting from blast injuries and prolonged exposure to combat conditions. Morrison's recovery process extended over several months and required multiple surgical procedures to address all of his injuries completely. However, the most difficult aspect of his healing involved processing the emotional trauma of losing his entire team while surviving circumstances that should have been fatal. Military psychologists worked with him extensively to address survivor guilt and help him understand that his actions had prevented an even greater tragedy from occurring. The investigation into the failed hostage rescue mission revealed that intelligence estimates about enemy strength and capabilities had been catastrophically inaccurate. The Taliban forces had been planning their ambush for several weeks, using the captured aid workers as bait to lure American Special Operations Forces into a carefully prepared trap. Morrison's solo assault had disrupted their plans sufficiently to allow rescue forces to survive their approach to the compound, ultimately saving dozens of additional American lives. Morrison's Medal of Honor ceremony took place nearly 18 months after the mission, during a White House event that honored his extraordinary heroism under impossible circumstances. The citation recognized his actions in single-handedly disrupting an enemy ambush that could have resulted in the destruction of multiple rescue helicopters and the deaths of their crews. However, Morrison felt that the real heroes were his fallen teammates who had died trying to save 3 innocent civilians. The 3 rescued hostages, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Engineer James Park, and translator Ahmad Hassan, had been recovered alive during the rescue operation, though they required extensive medical treatment for injuries sustained during their captivity. All 3 eventually made full recoveries and returned to their humanitarian work in other parts of the world, their survival representing the ultimate justification for the sacrifices made by Morrison's team. Morrison's return to active duty was complicated by the physical limitations resulting from his injuries, ultimately leading to his medical retirement from the Navy after 14 years of service. However, his experience and expertise made him an invaluable asset for training future special operations personnel, allowing him to continue serving his country in a different capacity. His lectures at various military schools became legendary for their unflinching examination of how individual decisions can determine the outcome of entire operations. The compound in Afghanistan was eventually abandoned by all military forces and returned to the control of local tribal authorities. However, the crater created by Morrison's ammunition depot explosion remained visible for years afterward, serving as a reminder of the extraordinary events that had occurred there. Local villagers began referring to the site as the place where one American fought an army, and the story became part of their oral tradition. Morrison's teammates were buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery, their sacrifice honored by thousands of military personnel and civilians who attended the ceremony. Chun, Tank, Ghost, Prophet, and the Sullivan brothers were posthumously awarded various decorations for their heroism during the failed rescue mission. Their families received not only the gratitude of a grateful nation, but also the personal promise from Morrison that their loved one's sacrifice would never be forgotten. The strategic implications of the mission extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, as intelligence gathered from the compound revealed extensive foreign involvement in Taliban operations. The professional military planning and equipment discovered at the site provided evidence of state-sponsored support for terrorist activities, leading to diplomatic and military responses that affected American policy throughout the region. Morrison's story became required reading at military academies and special operations training schools, not only for its tactical lessons, but also for its examination of leadership under extreme circumstances. His decision to continue fighting after his team was eliminated demonstrated the kind of individual initiative and moral courage that military leaders hoped to instill in future generations of warriors. Years later, Morrison established a foundation dedicated to supporting the families of fallen special operations personnel, using his celebrity status to raise awareness and funding for programs that help military families cope with loss and transition to civilian life. The foundation became his primary focus during retirement, allowing him to honor his teammates' memory through concrete assistance to others who had made similar sacrifices. The final chapter of Morrison's story was still being written as he continued working with veterans organizations and military support groups. His message remained consistent throughout all of his speaking engagements and charitable activities, that heroism wasn't about individuals performing superhuman feats, but about ordinary people making extraordinary commitments to protect others regardless of personal cost. The shot that had rung out on that mountainside in Afghanistan wasn't just the sound of one man's rifle firing at enemy forces. It was the sound of a warrior refusing to surrender, a teammate honoring his brother's sacrifice, and a guardian angel watching over those who still had the chance to come home alive. Morrison knew that he would carry the responsibility of that single shot for the rest of his life, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of the trust his fallen teammates had placed in him.